Helen Bowden. I'm the new chair of the Reuters Institute Steering Committee, trying to replace the irreplaceable Alan Rusbridger, who is here and who deserves a round of applause for all the work he put into it. It's genuinely a great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, the award-winning journalist Carlos Dada, the founder and editor-in-chief of the Salvadorian El Faro, the first digital news-only outlet in Latin America, and actually one of the first ones in the world. Since El Faro's launch, Dada and his colleagues have established it as a cornerstone of investigative journalism in Central America, specializing in reporting on corruption, organized crime, and human rights violations. His work is widely recognized in a region where traditional media has long been silenced by conflict and political pressure. Throughout his career, he's focused on the most difficult chapters of El Salvador's history, including the definitive investigation into the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero and the exposure of secret negotiations between the government and criminal gangs. His commitment to the truth has earned him many honors, including the Maria Moors Cabot Prize from Columbia University and being named a World Press Freedom Hero by the International Press Institute in 2020. Operating from exile due to mounting harassment and surveillance by his country's authoritarian government, Carlos continues to lead a team of reporters dedicated to holding power to account. His presence serves as the testament to the belief that the most important role of journalism, especially but not exclusively in autocracies, is to tell the truth based on proper evidence, providing a vital record for future generations, even when the political climate is increasingly hostile. Please give a very warm welcome to Carlos.
Thank you for those nice words, Helen. A few days ago, in a series of media interviews in Madrid, the Vice President of El Salvador, Félix Ulloa, said that his government has never negotiated or made any pacts with criminal organizations. He was lying. He said the decree of a state of emergency called the exception regime only applies to gang members, that human rights are not being violated in El Salvador's prisons. No one, he assured, has been tortured or died for lack of medical attention. He was lying. He said that El Salvador is a perfect model of democracy. He was lying. But lies are very powerful. Today is March 9, 2026. These are some of today's headlines around the world. Mojtaba Khamenei chosen as the new leader of Iran. Israeli offensive plunges Lebanon into a humanitarian crisis with 500,000 displaced people. Cuba is Trump's next target. China resumes military flights near Taiwan. That's just for today. The world is now in turmoil. We are witnessing the end of an era, and humanity is steadily sliding back to times when brute economic and military power determined the destiny of human beings. So much is at stake, and yet here I am talking about the Vice President of El Salvador and about what he said, as if it had any importance among these big events shaking the world. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. To the Reuters Institute, to Mitali Mukherjee, to Eduardo Suarez, to Cheris Leung, to the board of the Institute. Thank you for having me here. I have been guessing, why did you invite me to deliver this lecture? And my conversation with Eduardo, that I don't see him, he must be somewhere right here. Oh, there he is. My conversation with him gave me a few clues. Well, it is up to you to come up with the answer. I imagine you invited me because of the conditions under which Salvadoran journalists are operating these days at the onset of a dictatorship whose construction started in 2019 with the democratic electoral triumph of a young politician named Nayib Bukele. And perhaps you also think that El Faro's experience may be useful precisely now, when we are all at these new crossroads of history and feel the wind blowing against us. A far-right, populist, autocratic wave is taking the world by storm and breaking all the rules. And journalists, as in every authoritarian regime or dictatorship, no matter its ideological foundations, are labeled as enemies. Journalism is being criminalized, and our colleagues are being imprisoned or killed. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 2025 broke a record of 129 journalists and members of the press killed. Israel is responsible for 2/3 of those deaths. Discourses that remained hidden or on the margins for decades have now become mainstream, encouraged and embraced by political leaders. The language sounds somewhat familiar: the hate speech, the calls to nationalism, the construction of the other, the racist language, the tribal language, the populist language. It's always language. All of this has intoxicated the public discourse. Some responses also sound familiar. Last month, a United States federal judge cited George Orwell's 1984 to explain her decision to order the Trump administration to restore displays of ownership of enslaved people at a historical landmark. Last January, during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney used "The Power of the Powerless," Václav Havel's famous anti-totalitarian essay, as the backbone of his speech. This was revealing to me because I was precisely rereading Havel while mulling over the matters of truth and lies. If you think about it, it is a sign of the times that people so different as the Prime Minister of Canada and a journalist from El Salvador, we both thought that a book written half a century ago has something to say about the days we're living in. Particularly because Havel warns that his essay, and therefore any lessons derived from it, is only pertinent to what he calls a post-totalitarian state, namely the Soviet Union and the countries inside its sphere, among them Havel's Czechoslovakia. We are not there, of course, but this change of paradigms has just started, and we don't know where it is heading. In 1990, a few months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Mexican poet Octavio Paz wrote, "Los cambios que nos asombran son parte de un proceso que comenzó hace mucho y que no sabemos cómo ni cuándo terminará." The changes that have us in awe are part of a process that started long ago, and we don't know when or how it will end, end of quote. I don't think it ever ends. Motion is the constant in our universe. But what we are seeing now is the result of subterranean forces that we were reluctant to see, growing tired of the corruption and inefficiency of those who kept promising that democracy was a solution but seldom delivered, and the wide, unbearable distance between representatives and those they represent. In too many places, my country included, politicians' main goal has not frequently been to solve people's most urgent problems, but to win battles against political opponents. So here are the consequences: populism, concentration of power, the erosion of democracy. So where do we stand as journalists? I hear it every day. We have lost credibility and we have lost the public. Most people prefer to be reinforced in their prejudices rather than being challenged. So the algorithm is not putting our stories at the top of their timelines. All of that is true, but there is, it seems to me, also a conflict present in more and more parts of the world between the media and journalism, between the industry and the craft. Experience show that under autocratic regimes and dictatorships, the industry and the craft are more and more incompatible. Most of these regimes are built on half-truths or lies, so any discipline or institution dedicated to the search of truth, the academia, journalism, science, the humanities, is an obstacle to be overcome and silenced. Sooner rather than later, media managers and journalists will face a choice: sacrifice the business or sacrifice the journalism. In other words, sacrifice private interests or sacrifice the public interest, compromise or pay an existential price. So we should talk about truth and lies. Truth understood not as a big word that lives in the Platonic world of ideas and that has obsessed philosophers forever, but rather as a much simpler thing. Truth as the opposite of lies. In journalism, truth is understood as a result of information verified through an editorial process, therefore asserting facts. Truth, then, understood as a statement of fact. Lies, on the other hand, understood as a deliberate act of misleading, of deceit. Since we are at Oxford, let me use the Oxford English Dictionary definition of a lie. I quote, "To make a false statement with the intention to deceive." So you may pronounce falsehoods and yet not lie, you may just be wrong. Lying requires the intention to deceive. That's why I was talking about the Vice President of El Salvador. Let's go back to his recent assertions. 1. Bukele's government has never negotiated with gangs. Here's the truth. During the past 6 years, we at El Faro have been documenting and publishing Bukele's deals with the gangs. We have published official prison logs and security camera images, gang member testimonies, recording of phone calls between government officials and gang bosses. We have published photographies, witness stories, police intelligence information. We have confirmed every piece of information on these conversations with government officials, with a US task force chasing gang bosses that were illegally and secretly freed by Bukele. We have interviewed on camera gang bosses who were supposed to be in prison and who were free and living abroad. So when the Vice President says there has never been any pact with the gangs, he is lying because he's well aware of the evidence. 2, no one has been tortured in El Salvador's prisons or died as a result of it or for lack of medical attention. We, as well as other news outlets and human rights organizations, have gathered evidence of systematic torture inside El Salvador's prisons. We are now entering our 5th year living under a state of exception, which means the police can arrest any person for mere suspicion of working for the gangs. Since the beginning of the state of exception, in my small country, around 100,000 people have been imprisoned without any accusation and subject to secret mass trials if they're lucky. Today, El Salvador holds the dubious distinction of having the world's highest incarceration rate. Up to 2% of the population is now in prison. among them minors, human rights or environmental defenders, political opponents, victims of neighbors' false accusations, or simply people who crossed paths with a police officer having a bad day, or who had not yet hit the arrest quota demanded by the commissioners. According to reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and human rights defenders in El Salvador, the majority of people detained are not related in any way to gangs. More than 100 of those imprisoned are considered political prisoners. Trials are conducted by anonymous judges that determine the guilt or innocence of sometimes 900 individuals in a single hearing. About 10,000 people among those detained under the state of exception have been freed. We spoke to dozens of them, and they all tell the same stories of torture. Some have shown us the scars. We have even identified the prison guards in charge of that torture in several of the 22 prisons around the country. We have talked to mothers who have recovered the bodies of their sons, thin to the bones, with hematomas or brain damage. The coroner's office has concluded in every single case that the victim died of pulmonary edema, which is something akin to say that a person died because she stopped breathing. So, again, the president was lying. 3, El Salvador is a model of democracy. Almost a decade ago, Nayib Bukele, then mayor of San Salvador, broke up with his party, the leftist FMLN, and launched his bid for the presidency as an independent. Young and inexperienced, very few people believed he had any chance. The political landscape was absolutely controlled by two parties. The FMLN, which sucked up all the oxygen for political projects from the center to the extreme left, and the National Republican Alliance, Arena, which did the same from the center to the extreme right. Without their brand and their organization, Bukele's aim seemed impossible. But he and his team had spent years understanding social media and building what we call troll farms. They had an organic communication with new generations of voters who could not care less for the obsolete ideological battles of the main parties. Bukele's propagandists knew how to use technology in their favor and deliver the message directly to those new voters. That was their edge. He ran his campaign mostly on Twitter, on Facebook, and TikTok, promising to do away with our corrupt political establishment. In a poor country like mine, politicians campaign in markets and public squares. Bukele did none of that. A presidential campaign carried out entirely on the internet sounded preposterous, except for a peculiar fact that traditional politicians missed. In my poor country, smartphones outnumbered people, and their owners were eager for change. The bigger, the better. Bukele won by a landslide, and that was the end of the two-party system that dominated our political landscape for a quarter century. As soon as he got into office, he started eroding the institutions that held our democracy. He staged a coup d'etat against the Supreme Court, made the army and the police his instruments, seized control of the Attorney General's office, and restricted access to public information. He launched a witch hunt against the opposition that was received with cheers from most of the population. Bukele engaged in what scholars call accountability sabotage, which means the closure of access to public information, the suppression of political opposition and critical voices, and the undermining of democratic institutions. You've heard this story about different countries over and over again. Anti-democratic leaders being democratically elected. On his first visit to the United Nations General Assembly, Bukele took the stage and snapped a selfie. He then told the room that his selfie would be seen many more times than any of the world leaders' speeches. It may have been a trivial, superficial speech to give at the world's main forum, but he was right. His selfie and the message went viral. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Bukele's own Supreme Court approved his re-election against half a dozen articles of our Constitution. He is already in his second term with arguably the highest rate of popular support among all Western leaders. And us, as most independent media and human rights organizations, we are in exile. Not only El Faro's newsroom, but its administrative side as well. Let me tell you a bit about us. El Salvador began its democratic life in 1992, when the then revolutionary guerrillas, the FMLN, signed a peace agreement with the country's government to end our long civil war. It is no coincidence that our war, arguably the last battlefront of the Cold War, ended in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. After more than 6 decades of military regimes, we finally started to live in a democratic country. Repressive security forces were disbanded and army officers left government buildings and returned to their barracks. And even more shocking, human rights, two words completely absent from the official discourses, were put at the center of every public policy. Enter El Faro. When the peace agreements were signed, my parents decided it was time to go back to our country.
A Home Depot no le gusta cuando
We had
haces...
lived in exile during most of the war. I left El Salvador as a child and returned as an adult to a completely different place. Together with Jorge Simán, another returned exile, I founded El Faro in 1998, based on the conviction that a new country needed a new journalism. We were determined to contribute. El Faro could only come to exist in a democratic environment, so we grew and found our own voice over the course of a quarter of a century. Freedom of expression, freedom of the press, this was music to our ears, and we danced to it as much as we could. Journalism promised to fulfill our curiosity, and as Alma Guillermo Prieto said, allowed us to witness the human experience from the front row. Democracy allowed us to be independent, and independence allowed us to look to constantly expand our journalistic frontiers. Our democratic interregnum ended with the arrival of Nayib Bukele. Just 9 months into office, he entered Congress, surrounded by soldiers dressed for combat, and threatened to dissolve it. In an editorial, we called him a dictator in the making, and he declared us enemy of the people. He launched a smear campaign against us. His troll farms called us everything imaginable: drug addicts, gang members, sex abusers, paid agents at the service of the old system. The president tweeted against one of our advertisers, or more precisely, against one of the ads on our site. In a matter of hours, most of our advertisers pulled their ads from our newspaper. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Bukele imposed harsh measures on the population and declared an emergency, allowing his government to avoid public contracting laws, and he cut off access to public information. We exposed big corruption cases and broke the story on the government's deals with gangs as the real reason behind the dramatic descent in murder rates. The government accused us of making everything up and of working for terrorist organizations. In a televised national address, the president showed my photo and accused me of money laundering. Tax authority investigations followed immediately. We were accused of tax evasion. We moved El Salvador's legal residence to Costa Rica so he could not seize it and use it to disseminate propaganda. Meanwhile, we noticed strange people standing outside our homes and following us. Drones visited our houses. Inside sources showed us photos of ourselves. Threats arrived by the dozens. By the end of 2021, we learned that our phones had been hacked with the Israeli spyware Pegasus. We, as a collective, 22 out of El Faro's 30+ employees had been hacked during a year and a half. Other journalists from El Salvador were also hacked. When we made it public, we lost most of our sources, essential to practice journalism, but especially so under autocratic and opaque regimes. It changed a lot of things in our newsroom. It was a definitive proof that the price for practicing journalism had significantly risen. As a recent research from the Barcelona Autonomous University concluded, and I quote, El Salvador represents one of the most restrictive environments for press freedom in Latin America, where the concentration of political power and the convergence between technology and propaganda configure a model of techno-populist authoritarianism, end of quote. The Citizen Lab from the University of Toronto gave us logs of the days and times of every Pegasus activity in each of our phones. We cross-checked the timelines with our publications. Most of the hacking to most of the people happened immediately before, during, and after the publication of our big stories on corruption and Bukele's deals with the gangs. It also lined up uncannily with government attacks against the newsroom. Autocratic regimes and dictatorships need to impose a monologue to control the narrative. You have probably seen some of Bukele's viral tweets or videos, the cinematographic shots of head-shaved gang members, their naked torsos full of tattoos, sitting on the floor of an enormous prison square, each with his head on the back of the gang member in front of him, whose head is in turn on the back of the gang member in front, surrounded by imposing policemen in black, in absolute control of those criminals, inside one of the world's most notorious prisons. You have probably seen or heard about Bukele's X account, where he calls himself world's coolest dictator, or dictator of El Salvador, or philosopher king. A provocateur, his tweets threaten opponents, bark out orders to his cabinet, and insult the press, other presidents, and anyone who does not belong to this new club of extreme right populists and autocrats. A master of distraction, he gets everybody's attention, whether it is people enraged or emboldened by his provocations. It's visceral and it's viral. We have to talk about that. While Mr. Bukele held everyone's attention, his regime moved steadily. A recent study done by the Jesuit-run Central American University found that between 2019, the year he came into office, and 2024, Bukele's regime enacted at least 335 executive or legislative decrees that increased his concentration of power. Meanwhile, we were talking about his tweets. Now, there are some half-truths that keep his popularity high. In March 2022, for reasons we are still trying to understand, his deal with the gangs was broken. On a bloody weekend, the MS-13 gang killed 87 people and strewed their bodies all around the country. The state of exception was declared, and the police and the army began their campaign of mass incarceration. There was scant resistance from the gangs that had controlled many areas of the country for a couple of decades. For the first time in a generation, many of the inhabitants of these communities were living free from the rule of gangs. Perhaps the most important change in their lives. The price to pay, though, is a long-term one. The loss of our rights, the consolidation of a dictatorship, the exercise of power without checks or balances, Our destinies are in the hand of a single person or a small group of people. But that is easier to say or to see by someone like me who has not been living in one of those communities or held hostage at gunpoint by those gangs. It is not up to those citizens to come forward in defense of democracy or human rights. It is up to us. The repression against critical voices intensified last May. A foreign agents law was passed, making it almost impossible to receive funding from abroad without authorization from the regime. Universities, NGOs, and independent news organizations were the most affected. The police paid visits to journalists and human rights defenders. Environmentalists and 2 prominent lawyers were arrested. Since then, since last May, at least 53 independent journalists and dozens of human rights defenders have left the country to avoid incarceration. A recent poll showed that half the population is afraid of publicly expressing their opinion or criticizing the government. Like other independent media outlets, we are now a newsroom in exile, facing the biggest challenge in the life of El Faro, namely, how to report on a country where we can no longer live. In other words, how to avoid becoming a media of exiles, for exiles, a news site that talks about a country that no longer exists. We know that there is an easy way to stop the harassment and the threats and the drones and the hacking and exile. We need only quit. I don't think anyone could blame us if we did that. Some of our reporters have already done so. But we also know something else. If we decide to stay, we must do our job. For as long as we can do it, we will continue searching for this journalistic truth. We won't be an echo chamber for a dictatorship. We won't compromise or remain paralyzed. With the support of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University in New York, we sued NSO Group, the Israeli company that makes and sells Pegasus, in a US federal court. The case is still ongoing. In November 2023, almost 3 years ago, we declared ourselves a newsroom in resistance. We said, I quote again, "We are called to be an obstacle for those who seek to perpetuate themselves in power through absolutist projects that necessarily cancel citizen rights and fundamental freedoms. We are called to resist the suppression of a plurality of voices needed in a healthy society, to resist the attacks of those who cannot tolerate a narrative other than the official one. We are journalists in resistance to the violation of our rights, the shuttering of public information, in resistance to limitless power. We practiced journalism in democracy for a quarter century. That era is gone. Today, we are a newsroom in resistance." End of quote. That is the only way we can conceive our work today. Dictators like Bukele need lies to survive. We all know the handbook. What makes Bukele different is his capacity to turn those lies into a successful narrative that instantly becomes viral on social media platforms. In a recent poll in Chile, people were asked to mention a politician they admired, an open question. Half of the respondents answered Nayib Bukele. More than 5,500 kilometers separate San Salvador from Santiago de Chile. Whatever happens in El Salvador is of very little consequence in the lives of Chileans. So how do you explain that a construction worker on the outskirts of Santiago has Bukele at the top of his mind? Because Bukele's propaganda appears every day on his phone. The carefully produced videos of the gangs, the president lecturing soldiers and policemen are perfectly portrayed with studio illumination. the export of the idea of an efficient leader willing to break the rules to bring security to his country. Exactly what most Latin Americans, whose lives are more and more determined by criminal organizations, wish they had: an efficient leader with enough courage to solve their main security problems. He's so good at it that he is now more popular in each Latin American country than the president of that country, with the probable exception of Mexico. And now, after Donald Trump returned to the White House, Bukele has become a shooting star in the MAGA movement. A few weeks ago, The Guardian called him Trump's protege. He just spent this past weekend at Mar-a-Lago with a few other Latin American conservatives discussing strategies to advance the so-called Donroe Doctrine. Without political opposition and with such strong popular support and the erosion of civil society, Bukele's monologue is a marching band. If it wasn't for journalism and human rights organizations, Bukele's propaganda would remain undisputed. We are the ones left to resist. In a country that experienced civil war only 3 decades ago, it is striking that the search for truth has become again a subversive activity. It is more difficult, but more urgent, to question those in power. Information is dissent. Truth is dissent. And the rigorous production of information is considered dangerous. Journalism is resistance. And last but not least, an essential part of populist strategy is to create enemies and dehumanize them. This doesn't require too much explanation in Europe. In some places, it is the immigrants. In other places, it is the Jews, or the Muslims, or the Venezuelans, or the Palestinians. A government's priority in human rights, Bukele said, must be honest people. Since then, more than 3,000 children have been incarcerated in El Salvador. I consider it an essential part of our job to understand why most people are cheering the installation of dictatorships. And I think I have a good idea. But another important part is to defend the humanity of the victims of this language. Journalism must be, in my view, a humanist discipline. So let's bring Havel, Václav Havel back. And I quote, "We don't know the way out of the marasmus of the world, and it would be an expression of unforgivable pride were we to see the little we do as a fundamental solution, or were we to present ourselves, our community, and our solutions to vital problems as the only thing worth doing." End of quote. Of course, I would just add, nevertheless, what we do is still worth doing. If nothing else, we will leave testimony for future generations to better understand what the hell happened in our times, so the lies won't linger. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll have you ready to film it.
Oh, thank you. I mentioned your country quite a couple of times.
It's always hard to launch into a conversation right after you've heard something like this. You want a moment to absorb it and think about it. But we're pacing for time. So I think we will do that. And hopefully through the course of the next 30 minutes, the conversation that you hear from these esteemed panelists will take that forward and give us something more to think about. Carlos, first, thank you for being so courageous in your words, but also so thoughtful. I've got a very special panel here because I think each one of them in their own way has practiced journalism as resistance. Noah Landau, who is global editor at Haaretz. Noah is also part of the Reuters Institute Advisory Board. She's a part of her own organization's editorial board. And very proud to say Noah has been a journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute. Nicholas Tattersall, who is also part of Reuters, but is global managing editor. So he's sort of been around the world, reported from very difficult situations. And now, aside from all the work that he oversees, is also responsible for safety and security for journalists at Reuters. God knows his phone must be trilling at every hour. Thank you for joining in. Carlos, let me start with you, and maybe this seems simplistic for someone on the outside, but I think it's worth sort of addressing on the point that you made about journalism as resistance, coercion, physical threats, legal intimidation, danger to sort of life and liberty have almost gone hand in hand with critical reporting at every stage in history. What feels different this time?
Again, I think a lot of the language and a lot of the things are familiar. A lot of the things are in common with the past. But of course, there are new things that I think that the use of technology has made it much worse. It spreads these dangerous discourses at a really fast speed. And it is a great aid for those, again, that want their prejudices to be reinforced and not challenged. I think that good journalism, what it does is it challenges the prejudices of everyone. It's more comfortable to feel reinforcing your prejudices. And I think that now that we get our information, or our content as it is now called, on our phones, it becomes a completely individual activity. The communities are made inside the phones with people that share your prejudices, not with people willing to discuss, to debate, to dialogue. And I think this is a huge difference that makes it more dangerous.
I want to talk about causality, and I'm sure we will get into that through the course of this conversation. But Nick, for you, you've sort of got a 360 view on a lot of what's happening around the world. I hate to use the word peak because the peaks have changed over the years. But how does it feel in this moment in time, just looking at newsrooms across the world for Reuters?
I think it's an incredibly, clearly an incredibly challenging environment. And I think, we think about risk in a number of different ways. And I mean, the stories that you've told are both extraordinary and the challenges that your organization continues to face. But unfortunately, increasingly common and familiar to other locations around the world. I think we at Reuters we're present on the ground in a huge across all of the globe, and that ranges from frontline conflict situations in eastern Ukraine, of course, in the Middle East as we're seeing now, but a longer tail of countries and locations around the world where we face any mix of physical risk, emotional and mental resilience risk to journalists, legal risk and cyber risk. And I think that's really what's changed in recent years. We've had to take a much more holistic approach to the kind of risks that we're facing, not just in investigative reporting, but in day-to-day coverage in a growing number of countries around the world.
Noah, you've said to me in sort of half irony several times that it sort of comes with the turf in terms of the region that you've reported in and how difficult it's been. How would you define this moment in time for the Haaretz newsroom? And I suppose an additional question to that, did you decide as a newsroom to act as journalism as resistance? Was it sort of embedded into the DNA of the newsroom, or is it a wholly different approach? I want to thank Carlos for this very powerful speech. And I was also about to say that the audience seems younger every time, but I think I'm getting older. How would I define this moment? Horrible, horrible. But in a sense, it's true that in the Middle East, and specifically in Israel and Palestine, we're kind of used to cover wars. But it's not, I think these past 2 years have not been the same. It's not the kind of, in terms of, the magnitude, the catastrophe, the trauma, it's very different from what we were used to. So on one hand, yes, we've kind of specialized in, these situations, but on the other hand, it is new for us. And a lot of, I think, what we needed to realize is that we're not as expert of it as we think we are. In terms of resistant journalism, I think maybe it's a similar answer, because on one hand, yes, Haaretz has always seen himself as, we oppose the occupation, write editorials about it, always see ourselves in a very specific side of the journalistic coverage. But we also had to kind of realize that this is also different from that point of view, that we now need to do a lot more and kind of harness even more energy to be on that side of journalism that we want to be.
Carlos, you shared that very interesting anecdote about how Chile sees a leader from El Salvador is hugely popular.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about the fact that part of this is practicing journalism in both populist governments and with popular leaders. And you were quoting back so much of what was discussed several decades ago. I came across a quote from a conference in 1967 at the LSE that was around populism. And there was a sentence there describing it, saying, "There can at present be no doubt about the importance of populism, but no one is clear what it is." How do you describe, in your individual context as a journalism in your region, what a populist government means for practicing journalism there?
I think you have to invite me again, because I thought I had spent half an hour trying to explain that.
We're not done with you.
It is that when they determine the people's needs, the people's fears, and the people's aspirations, and then manipulate the language to try to get in touch with them. They create an enemy so they can blame, so the public can blame someone for that. In part of the efficiency of populism is the way they simplify it with the language. So it's not, for example, the immigrants is a good example. Right? Immigrants are just a group of human beings among which you have criminals, you have very decent people, you have families, you have a human community. Or a group of humans. When one of the bad guys from that group commits a crime, it's not that that guy is a criminal, it's that the whole group is labeled. Right? So it's not this guy that robbed a woman in a small town in Colombia. It's the Venezuelans that came here to commit crimes against us. It's a very effective discourse, because it connects directly with the fears of the people.
Let me ask the question another way. Does reporting on a far-right populist government look the same as reporting on a far-left populist government?
Yes. Yes. I mean, we've seen this, what I have been described, and Bukele is a good example, particularly because he has no ideology. Politically, he's an opportunist. So he's been in both sides. He came from the leftist of MLN. He is now a reference of the extreme right. I mean, he's so to the right that he's become libertarian. Right? he is the inspiration of all these Bitcoiners and crypto brothers, and he has become a reference for libertarians. So he went all the way. His father is the founder of Islam in El Salvador. Now, you would see him almost kneeling and talking about God as from an evangelical point of view. So this is another good example to illustrate this. For example, Venezuela, right, which has had a populist leftist regime. Public policies in El Salvador right now are designed by a group of Venezuelan advisors to Mr. Bukele. But they all come from the opposition. So this has to do with the ambition to remain in power more than with ideologies. Ideologies are just a vehicle, and it's very opportunistic in some cases. I mean, I'm not saying in every case it's the same.
Yeah.
But the case of El Salvador, I think it's interesting because it illustrates that populism is as dangerous to practice the search for the truth, as I called it, as independently of its ideological sign. Sorry, it took so long.
No, some of the more recent research around populism from the people also points to sort of economic discontent, of course, as being one of the catalyzing forces, this idea of the elite versus the masses, and at the heart of it, pessimism, a deep pessimism about the situation as it stands. Now, this rubs against a lot of the research that we do at the Reuters Institute that points to audiences moving away from the news because it is overwhelming and depressing, and they sort of feel a lack of any ability to do anything about it. How do you practice journalism in that sort of sandwich situation?
We think a lot about this, this term news fatigue, right? People are tired of the news, but the reality doesn't stop just because you're tired of it. And if you go to sleep or watch Netflix, the news doesn't go away. It only becomes worse. And we're thinking a lot, about how, I don't have the answer, by the way, spoiler. And if someone does, please let me know. But we're thinking a lot about how we can persuade our audience to understand that we don't have the luxury to be tired of the news. Of course I am, we all are. But if we just look away, if we just, switch it. Today, news organizations, they don't compete with another news outlet. They compete with something else on your phone. So it's either, you open now the Haaretz app, and yes, it's depressing, or you can, watch something else and, kind of escape into a more positive atmosphere. And I understand people who do it. I really understand it on a personal level. But that actually means that we will not be able to continue doing what we're doing. Not Carlos, not Haaretz, not, any news organization that really tries to fight for something. So news fatigue is really, I think, a huge problem for us now. Probably, maybe, in our region, probably maybe one of the worst problems that we're facing.
I think there's probably as much newsroom fatigue as we speak. It's been sort of an intense news cycle for a couple of years now. On the point Carlos was raising about the sort of facets of intimidation, particularly in populist governments, in some ways the set piece is clear when you're working in areas of conflict or war. You know what you're supposed to do to keep your journalists safe. How do you protect them in setups such as this?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's an increasing challenge in a growing number of countries. I think part of it is around emotional resilience and preparedness. If we're working on an area of coverage that we know is against a polarized backdrop, where unfortunately our journalists themselves may become part of the story, to prepare them for that mentally and emotionally, but also to prepare crucially from a self-doxing standpoint. So in other words, making sure that their social media presence, that all the discoverable information about them out there is as locked down as it possibly can be. So practicing very, very good cyber hygiene. to essentially make themselves as individuals lesser targets. And this is something that's changed and is, evolving depressingly quickly, that, cyber risk, what can initially look like intimidation, harassment online, can very rapidly translate into, physical risk. We've seen cases from North America to, other parts of the world where what's looked like intimidation and harassment of journalists online has translated into physical threats in, quite quickly. So a lot of the preparedness is around emotional, mental resilience, crucially also actually anticipating potential legal threats and being very clear about what legal defenses are available and almost more importantly, what aren't, so that you're very clear about the parameters of risk as you go into that sort of reporting.
Do you think it opens up a sort of a natural gap between the ability of a small-sized newsroom, something like an Faro, to actually protect its journalists that way versus something that has the muscle of a Reuters newsroom?
Well, I would say we're very fortunate as a large organization. We have a strong legal team. We have an editorial safety team. I mean, interestingly, quite often the conversations I end up having with some of our journalists are, you need to go back and legal need to look at this for a fifth time, or, the safety team just want to review this again. And sometimes they, our journalists at times can be frustrated because they can feel like it's slowing down or putting a brake on their reporting. Actually, it isn't. It's giving us the broadest shoulders we can possibly have to go out and do the boldest, most ambitious reporting we can, but knowing, what the limits of our legal defense are, what the limits of our ability to mitigate the risk that they may be facing are. So it's a long-winded way of saying, I'm glad to work for an organization that's well-resourced in that respect, but I recognize that it's far harder in organizations that don't have that recourse.
Carlos, you made the point about people sort of reading what they want to read and being fed more and more of the kind of point of view that they agree with or they lean towards. I'm dipping back into our research again, and one of the questions we ask is how people confirm information that they think may be untrue. And what we found was that it was easier to point to where people go depending on their political leanings, but there's a big chunk in the middle, sometimes larger than people leaning left or right, who don't know where to go and who don't know whom to speak to. And that's layered with the fact that for a lot of people, journalism is seen as quite elitist, kind of reporting on a very small section of people and catering to a very small section of people. How do you respond to both those points of criticism?
Yes, answers to these questions are not easy, Mitali. But I mean, what I would say is that I don't think we have the responsibility to guide people to this side or to the other side. We have the responsibility to establish facts. If you're not tired of me talking about El Faro, I can tell you this. When the extreme right arena was governing, they accused us of being the speakers of the communists of the country. And when the FMLN came to power, they accused us, because we were breaking stories on their corruption, also on their deals with gangs, they accused us of being the voice of the oligarchy. Now Bukele is accusing us of being the enemies of the people and the voice of all the others that came before him. I think that now more than before, we are obliged to be much more rigorous. It's very tempting to fall into this exchange of words, of insults, because you're being the receptor of aggression by every single platform. I open Twitter and I am a piñata for a lot of people. It's very tempting, but we need to be clear that we need to be more rigorous than ever. Especially now, the only thing that we keep is credibility, and it's very easy to lose it. So again, our job is to establish facts. I don't want to direct people to vote this or to vote that, or to the left or to the right. Particularly in my country, left and right proved the same capacity for corruption. So it's not an ideological thing. Yeah.
Sometimes my favorite button on Twitter is mute, not block, just mute. Noah, what's the Haaretz experience, both in terms of this anti-elite narrative that is built by some populist leaders, and this, I suppose, circular relationship between the media needing to report on the populist leader piling on the media, saying they're elite, but also needing the oxygen of that media coverage?
You know, in my country, it's interesting, and I'm pretty sure it's similar to some others, that, you know, the ruling party has been promoting this idea that they represent a suppressed minority when they're actually in power for so many years. And, you know, the question is also, who is the elite now? Because, you know, there's Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power for some of the people your generation here in the audience. For them, it was the only prime minister they ever knew. And they've been in power, you know, that long. And then they also now have more and more news outlets that, you know, officially and publicly align with the government's position. There's been a lot of, you know, attacks on the, I know, you know, I always, side note, I always, you know, understand that when I'm talking about, you know, the troubles of the Israeli media, it's nothing compared with the troubles of the Palestinian media. That aside, there are more and more attacks on the Israeli media in terms of, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu wanting more favorable coverage. So he's been, you know, launching his own media operations, etc. And so now they have, you know, they're the ruling party for so long. They have their own media outlets very publicly supporting them. They have, they've changed almost everyone in public, you know, positions because they've been in power so long. So there's almost no one that they can point at, you know, whether it's in media or in the public sphere, that they actually did not appoint. So who is the elite here, and who is the suppressed?
One of the challenges of reporting in situations such as these, or climates such as these, is equivalency and balance, and how to sort of achieve that impartiality. Are all ideas equal? How do you sort of debate them in Haaretz, and how do you present them?
Well, first of all, regarding impartiality, I mean, we're not, I think this whole idea of, we're already past that discussion about objectiveness, right? We do have a view, a point of view, even if you don't want people to vote for this party or for that party, you still have a world view of what is right and what is wrong. So, you know, we're not aiming for that kind of impartiality. In terms of, are you asking in terms of how do we, you know, weigh the opinions or the kind of discourse that we're publishing?
How deeply as a newsroom are you thinking about this idea of impartiality in this moment in time?
Well, we also look at ourselves, you know, when it comes to the news, we look at ourselves as people who are actually, you know, publishing the facts, even if, you know, larger and larger part of the population doesn't like these facts, they are still the facts. We also have views, not only news. And on that sense, we have two separate issues. One is that more and more views, we believe, are not actually views. If someone wants to ethnically cleanse Gaza, that's not a view that we want to publish, you know, as a regular op-ed. We have, you know, there's limitation and red lines, even if in that, you know, sphere of freedom of speech. And there are things that we need to explain more and more to larger parts of the population why we actually do not think that this is a legitimate view. On the other hand, our own audience that knows why they read us want more and more of what what they think, because they view us as this like last bubble of a publication that actually writes about the thing that they care about. And a bit similarly, I think that's something I saw in the New York Times in recent years. If there's an opinion that doesn't align with our audience, they're very upset about it, and it's a national sport to cancel their subscription. Then they do the subscription again so they can cancel it again. It's kind of a hobby. But that's a problem that we also face. People want more and more of their own views on one hand, and more of the views out there in the world are not something we considered worth publishing.
Nick, I imagine at Reuters with the trust principles, that's something that is a fine line for you to walk as well.
Yes, I mean, we, you know, are again operating, you know, all around the world, and we're exactly as Carlos and Noah have said, you know, are pursuing facts and are pursuing evidence, and evidence-based journalism, no surprises journalism, as we call it. So going to all sides on a story through the front door and saying, look, these are the findings we've got. These are the accusations. These are the allegations. These are the issues and the facts that we have found that we need your comment on is something that we do, you know, rigorously pre-publication. And I think, you know, I would agree that actually, you know, there is hope here in that, you know, we're a relatively new entrant as Reuters to a subscription, you know, direct to consumer model. So we have a website and we have subscribers. That's quite new for us. But we've seen, you know, notably in the last sort of 6 months or so, you know, the events of last weekend, you know, the events, you know, when Trump was imposing tariffs and there was a huge amount of confusion, that again, there was a surge of traffic towards the site, and interestingly, coming to us through breaking news, through the live pages, through the front, rather than necessarily through the deeper reporting. And that was then converting into subscriptions where people were finding content that was not opinion content, it was deeper reporting. It was human stories that went, you know, that gave context and that gave fact-based analysis. So we're seeing glimmers of hope that actually doing just that, going after the evidence, finding the facts, does find audience.
Carlos, I want to go back to the reality of how El Faro functions, which is a newsroom in exile. Increasingly, I have conversations with journalists in other countries who wonder what it would be like. And that this is sort of an option that they should be considering and thinking about. What does it look like for your journalists in your newsroom?
Well, this is the sad fact is that we're not an exception. Is that in the last decade, the number of countries that were democracies and have fallen into different categories have, like, today, the majority of countries in the world are not functioning democracies. This was unthinkable 15 years ago. In a lot of these countries, the practice of journalism has become the facing of this spending on and resources to investigate power. I mean, I only conceive journalism as demanding accountability from power, investigating power. You stand in front of power, not next to power. But now, the power right now has been so effective that it is draining resources from us for different things that is not doing our job. And I have to say, it's very effective. Now, just one more thing. For people that are asking themselves, what if I have to go into this? I have good news.
We saved it for the last.
History teaches us that these too will pass. So this is what I tell my newsroom, but when this ends, we still want to be here doing our job. there's only one way to get there, and it's keep doing our job in a rigorous manner. Because if we lose that, then when this is over, we will be over too. But it will be over.
I'm not sure if you want to share the optimism, Noah. We are not, as Carlos said, where we were 15 years ago, and to quote the same Canadian president to you, nostalgia is not a strategy.
Of course it will be. Of course it will be over. The question is when. I hope in my lifetime. What is the strategy? Actually, I was really. I like the ending of your speech. I really identified with it. You spoke about, at least being kind of the archive of history. And a good friend of mine who's an historian once told me that, when I was kind of depressed about what kind of change are we even, making any difference now? And she studied slavery in America, and she told me, she's been reading newspapers from that time for so long. And maybe it's not so optimistic, but I really identify with that we at least can be, the first draft of history, in the sense that, we are the archive. We write these facts, maybe for another generation, but it's still a job that's important to do.
Both of you at different points in time.
I'm sorry, it wasn't very optimistic, was it? I tried.
Both of you at different points through the last few days have talked to me about how you're thinking about impact. What does impact look like for journalism? Have you reached any conclusion? Do you think about it a certain way?
There is a comfortable and an uncomfortable answer for ourselves.
Yeah.
The comfortable answer is that we're not in a contest of popularity. That's not our job. The uncomfortable answer is that we want to reach as many people as we want, particularly because we think we have established some facts, and we want that to reach everybody. Our idea with which most of journalists start their careers is that we have these utopias of changing our small world, if you want, through this job. Well, it has to reach people. That's very difficult today because, as Noah said, we are now competing with a lot of these so-called content producers, which englobes basically everything. A lot of these propaganda disseminators, a lot of fake news, a lot of lies, basically lies, but that connect directly with fears of people to make them feel comfortable with this discourse. So it's much harder. What's really worrying me is to see traditional allies of journalism falling into this discourse, thinking, we now have to start supporting content producers. Well, what the hell are they going to talk about? Right? But this is really worrying me because despite of all what a lot of media are going through under this world, these conditions, we also need to be viral to reproduce our impact, to reach more people, and we just don't know how to do it anymore. We are drained of resources. We are drained of capacities. I am working at minimal with my team. So I'm really worried when I see traditional allies of journalism speaking this language. We now need to shift to content producers.
Nick, how do you think about impact?
Well, at its best, impactful journalism leads to policy change. It leads to those in power being held properly to account. But I think more broadly, there is, and I agree with the challenges that we face are growing, but I think there's also a responsibility on us as journalists to find ways of telling stories that do connect and that do, have an impact in that sense. I mean, the example that comes to mind, I worked for a long time in West Africa, and one of the stories I covered at the time was the migrant crisis, and latterly when I was back in London, we were looking at that particularly bad period a few years ago of an awful lot of lives lost at sea in the Mediterranean, and there were shipwrecks every day. And it got to a point where a headline that said, a ship has capsized off the coast of Italy and 200 people have drowned, was horrendous to say, was not really cutting through, because it was happening on a daily, if not daily, certainly weekly basis. And so the storytelling had to be, you've got to get out into the Mediterranean, you've got to film and capture these incidents as they happen, you've got to get to the families involved, both at the departure points, you've got to get to the detention centers in Europe and tell those human stories. I mean, it's one example, and similarly with coverage of Gaza, the horrors that were a reality every day, it got to a point where that coverage was just not cutting through and people were switching off. And I mean, one piece of reporting I remember from Gaza was not our own, but it was reporting on the story of a business that had been a successful fish restaurant and how to pass from generation to generation and sort of putting it in history. It was a different way of storytelling. So, I think, again, holding the powerful to account, having impacts that can change policy, that can change, lead to outcomes in the real world is one type of impact. I think another type of impact where we have to keep challenging ourselves is storytelling that really cuts through the noise and connects with audiences.
A final question to you, Noah, and to you, Carlos, and then we will open up for a few questions from the audience. A lot of the work you've done is, as you documented as well, covers crime, covers extreme violence, covers a lot by way of loss. And it's hard to explain that to someone who's not part of a profession like journalism. What sort of mark does it leave on you?
Personally, I try not to think about it so much because it's part of the defense mechanism, right? I can tell you, as an anecdote that we had a new young editor at the news desk early on October 23. She knew she was coming, to be an editor at the news desk, of course, but she came to us, after a few weeks, and she said, this is too hard. The materials are just, she gets, as a junior editor, she gets all the raw material, and part of her job is, go through that. And we, the simple answer is that we really increase the mental support that we give people on the news desk. The month that followed the events of October 7th, we brought in therapists to the building to give free sessions to everyone because people, were impacted in all sorts of ways. And I think actually the industry is better at it now, understanding that when I was a junior editor, I don't think we had the same, we didn't understand that as much as we do now, that it is important to support the staff in that sort of way. But I'm sure, of course it does leave a mark. But on the other hand, coming from such a region, people that are in all sorts of, medical professions are also traumatized. A lot of people, that are on the front line of many aspects of this war are traumatized. People, just regular people, sitting in their homes and sitting in a bomb shelter are traumatized. So in that sense, also, maybe we're not that special as journalists when that's the whole environment around us.
That's exactly what I think. Yes, it leaves a mark on you. Every exile is a tragedy. It's a personal tragedy. Every single one it is. There's no way to get rid of that. But I've covered a lot of stories. I'm particularly interested on the effects of the decisions of the powerful into the lives of normal people, right? Particularly in what I call the dark corners, in my case in Central America. Dark corners where the light of the state never shines. I am a privileged after all. So does it has consequences? Yes, it has. I just don't think it's of public interest. And that for me is a big difference. I think I am a privilege to have a platform, and I should use it to tell the stories of people that are doing much worse than I am doing.
We're going to open for questions now. If you could raise your hand and we can get a mic to you. Perhaps I'd like to start with Diana Lone, Reuters journalist fellow, and then we'll move from there.
Hi.
We can hear you, Diana.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, I would like to thank Carlos for being here. It was an excellent speech. I'm Thai from Brazil, and we've been through. Fortunately, we avoided overall what El Salvador has experienced, but we don't know until when. And actually, my question comes from, I'm a leadership in my organization. I run Aos Fatos, which is an organization dedicated to combat disinformation, and digital authoritarian threats. And I'd like to know actually, when was the time that you actually decided personally, but as an institution, to leave the country? If there was a specific, very specific turning point, or if it was something that you had already planned beforehand, and what were like very specific challenges in doing that transition? Because I might imagine in 2022 we also had developed a plan if things were, if things went wrong, we for sure didn't have to do that, but we'll be having to think about it again due to the elections this year. So yeah, these are my questions.
Thank you. First of all, let me start with good news for you. I believe that during the Bolsonaro years, the development of Brazilian journalism was completely amazing. Let me give you an example. A magazine like Piauí, that was an exquisite narrative cultural magazine, started developing investigative journalism to the highest levels. I'm just talking about Piauí, not talking about a lot of other media that started to do an amazing work. So I think you're more ready than we were when this happened. I think that's the good news. I don't know if there's a turning point. For most of Salvadoran journalists, the turning point was last May. What happened last May? We published an interview with 2 gang members that I mentioned that were supposed to be in prison that were freed, that revealed a lot of the details of the pact they had made with Bukele. When we published it on video, Bukele's speakers or troll farms reacted in the traditional way they did, which was to say that we had made everything up. Right? We are famous for writing very long stories, written stories, but this one we published on video. What a difference. My country has 6 million people. That interview had 2.5 million views. And so when they started saying that we have made it up because we are friends of the gangs, that we are well, there was something that was undeniable. People saw that there were 2 gang members that were supposed to be in prison that were not in prison. Only that, plus what these guys said, that was horrible things, what really had an impact on people. What I'm trying to tell you is that for the first time, the Bukele regime lost control of the narrative, because that's what they are savvy at. That's a fundamental part of their political strategy. For the first time, they lost it. So then they started doing what they had done before, to mount a case against us publicly. Right? So we had already been sentenced as aids to terrorist organizations. And we know what follows in a country where a single guy controls the Attorney General's office, the judges' circuit, the Supreme Court, blah, blah, blah. They mount the case in public, so they normalize the situation, and then they proceed to arrest you, blah, blah, blah. So that was last May. This is when most, and then they proceeded to arrest a couple of people. This is when most of journalists and human rights defenders decided to leave. Police started visiting their homes. So it was a very clear intensification of a repressive wave. That was the turning point. El Faro was the first exiled of El Faro. El Faro, the media, was the first exiled. We moved it to Costa Rica to avoid the Bukele government when he was accusing us of money laundering and tax evasion. We thought this guy wants to proceed and get hold of El Faro to disseminate his propaganda and fake news. We have to save El Faro from that. So we moved the legal registration of El Faro to another country. Yeah, El Faro was the first exiled of El Faro.
The bad news is that I've done a bad job of timekeeping. The good news is that there's a drinks reception, so you can actually have a longer conversation with the panelists. But what I'm going to try and do is club a few questions and then bring them to our panel. So maybe the lady at the back there, the lady here, and Sophia down there. I know that's a lot of instructions for you. So we'll start there, and then we'll go there, and then to Sophia. Perfect, thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Thank you so much. My name is Ezra. I'm a journalist, an academic from Turkey. So the journalistic sphere you described a few minutes ago is very, familiar to me, because we have our own popular dictators, obviously Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and the similar journalistic sphere under the censorship and unfree press. I wonder, because in my country, this is my opinion, that majority of the public doesn't want to get the truth from the journalists. There is a big resistance from the public to deny what happened in the past or what's going on right now in the country. For example, when it comes to Armenian issue, Kurdish issue, or Middle East, or sensitive issues, financial issues going on in the country, majority of the people are saying that journalists are lying, not the politicians. Actually, that's the opposite.
Got it.
So is there a big demand from Salvadorian public to learn the truth from the journalists?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
In the case of Middle East, we noticed that the difference is quite subtle but stark in the way the Western media uses words like Israelis are always killed by missile strikes, but Iranian/Syrian/Palestinians are just dead. And the cause is not acknowledged soon enough. In case of El Salvador, do you notice any such differences in how the issues in your country are projected in the Western media? And the second part of my question, if there's time, is how agencies like Reuters fact check this. Is it just that for Western media, like even very big organizations like BBC and New York Times, is it just that it's quicker to verify information in Israel compared to maybe Iran or Gaza or Syria, or is it just pure bias?
Sophia.
Carlos, you talked about the business of journalism and the craft being in conflict. Do you see any way that they could fuel one another, and what conditions would be needed for this?
Nick, maybe I'll start with you about both the question around fact-checking and whether there is sort of selective projection in information.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a complex topic, but if I understood the question correctly, what I would say is that use of language is incredibly important, and this is very active and constant debate among our editors, and I'm sure in most professional newsrooms. And so too is sourcing. And I think you make a very good point. We have to be incredibly careful that we are both using the right language, and where there's equivalence and making that clear, and are sourcing very, very carefully. So, it's an incredibly important issue, I would say.
Noah, anything you'd like to add to that?
To which one?
On the question about whether there is, as you see it, selective projection in terms of how events are reported and what the fact-checking process is, and whether it looks different in different situations.
So short answer, yes, of course, we see different language by different news outlets. I can tell you in Israel, we increasingly see people are upset with the word killed. So now you have to say that everyone is murdered by missiles or something else, because killed is just not enough emotionally for people. And I personally, I really think that this kidnaps the whole conversation when we're too focused on, someone was just killed in a war. Is it really worse if it was murdered or killed in that war? I'm not sure, but people tend to focus on this a lot, and not on sometimes at the expense of the actual event that took place. In terms of fact checking, there are two things I've noticed. One, it's harder and harder to do a very good job at fact checking when people are less and less patient for us to verify things. In a matter of, in a second, everyone already thinks that they know everything. Everyone thinks that they know everything. Everything is on social media. Everyone has already made their opinion. And if it takes us more time to verify things, which often is the case because information is not that easy to, find, then it's really hard to bring back people to that conversation and reconsider their position because they already made up their mind. So in terms of fact-checking, I think, of course, we try to be more timely, but oftentimes, to have a really good understanding of something that happened, it takes time.
The two questions that came in: does the public in El Salvador want to know the truth? And what is, as you see it, required for the craft to meet the industry?
I would say not now, but they will. It's just not now. And I understand a lot of that people. I do understand them. It's part of my job. But they will be interested. When the honeymoon passes, when they realize the consequences of having a dictator deciding your destiny, then they will turn to see all the work we've been doing. And I wouldn't say anyone, and it's not the case in Turkey, that anyone. It's just that a lot of people don't. But that small group that keep finding that your work is credible because you present evidence every single time. You're not in a contest of discourses. You have to present evidence, which is the main difference that we have with politicians. So that small group starts growing and growing and growing. Every moment that the disenchantment with the regime augments. Let me give you a small example. We have been documenting torture inside the prison, the return of systematic torture for the first time since our civil war. Well, systematic torture or unjust imprisonments, you're talking about real people that have relatives. We have been collecting these testimonies, inspired in a way by Archbishop Romero, but that's another story. The thing is that the relatives of these unjustly imprisoned people are every day more and more and more and more. They stop believing the propaganda and they started to looking for facts that explain their situation. And when that happens, they look at us. I mean, not only at El Faro. I'm not talking about El Faro. I'm talking about journalism as a craft in general. So, so that's my answer. Not now, but they will.
Do you want to quickly answer the question about the craft and the industry as well?
Oh, yes, that's a very good question. Well, I'm just going to tell you two words. The Washington Post. That's my answer to you.
And ladies and gentlemen, Nicholas Tattersall, Noah Landau, Carlos Dada. Thank you for joining us this evening. There is a drinks reception, and I would encourage you to talk to our panelists, but also talk to each other.